Erika, adivina qué.
¿Qué?
Hoy
Novelas eh, que hablan desde la ficción hasta la política.
Ok, oye, también te cuento que sabes que Carmen Bullosa, una de nuestras ponentes, pues es una poeta, dramaturga, novelista y ensayista mexicana, nació en Ciudad de México en 1954 y hoy nos acompaña aquí junto con Denise Dresser y Siri Hustvedt.
Denise Dresser es una autora mexicana eh, y profesora de una universidad. Ahora ella es miembro de la facultad del Departamento de Ciencias Políticas del Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México.
Oigan, pues les queremos comentar que este tipo de eventos los tenemos todos los días aquí en la Feria Internacional del Libro en Cintermex. Les recuerdo que el boleto es totalmente gratuito, nada más pagas tu estacionamiento y lo que te vayas a llevar de aquí. Yo la otra vez, Erika, me compré unos separadores de libros inteligentes, estaban padrísimos, diferentes diseños y te pueden separar no nada más la hoja, sino que también el párrafo o más bien la frase en que te la quedaste, en donde te quedaste. Costaron
¡Qué
más o
increíble!
menos como 35 pesitos, me llevé
Muy barato.
3, me encantaron y pues ahí los tengo en mis libros que me compré aquí en la Feria Internacional del Libro. Oye, Erika, ¿cómo te has estado pasando en estos días?
Me la he estado pasando increíble, se ve mucho movimiento de gente, mucha gente joven que se alegra, que se comparte aquí mucha información.
Totalmente, fíjense, ahorita estamos viendo cómo van las personas entrando pues la conferencia, a la mesa estelar de la subversión de las mujeres con Denise Dresser, Carmen Bullosa y Siri Hustvedt, ahorita a las 7. Estamos viendo cómo están pasando y acomodándose. En un ratito más tendremos aquí en la transmisión este evento estelar. Les recuerdo que también tenemos toda la semana llena de eventos. Estamos en el antepenúltimo día aquí en la Feria Internacional del Libro. ¿Algo que me quieras comentar acerca de tu experiencia aquí dentro de la Feria Internacional del Libro? ¿Qué has visto? ¿Cómo ves a las personas, Erika?
Veo a mucho estudiante por aquí, eso es muy increíble. Veo a mucha gente haciendo fila para esta conferencia que se me hace espectacular.
Algo importante que tenemos que agregar es que no nada más es para estudiantes, sino para cualquier fanático de la literatura e incluso para estas personas que se quieren adentrar por primera vez a todo el mundo literario, ¿no? Hay que admitir que yo, por ejemplo, dejé la lectura hace un tiempo, pero estoy tratando de retomarla poco a poquito y gracias a los separadores y eventos como este vamos a hacer un hábito renovado. Oye, Erika, vámonos ya de una vez al evento de la Mesa Estelar, la subversión de las mujeres, aquí en la Feria Internacional del Libro. Yo soy David Carrión.
Y yo, Erika Camacho.
Y esto es la unidad de producción de medios digitales del TEC de Monterrey. Muchas gracias. amigos, ahorita estamos con Anika, también de escritores independientes. Dime, Anika, ¿qué libro escribiste tú?
Se llama Seven Wonders, a K-Pop's Journal, un diario de K-Pop.
Ok, y dime, ¿de qué trata?
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Monterey International Book Fair 2022. I'm Emma Freeman, professor at the School of Humanities and Education at Tecnológico de Monterrey, and it's an extraordinary honor to open this event. Tonight, we will have the pleasure of listening to a conversation between three internationally recognized intellectuals: Siri Hustvedt, Carmen Bujosa, and Denise Dresser. I will briefly introduce our guests tonight, although they are very well known. I think it's appropriate to highlight just a few of their accomplishments. Siri Hustvedt is a novelist and scholar. She has a PhD in English literature and is a lecturer in psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College. She is the author of a book of poems, 4 collections of essays, 2 works of nonfiction, and 7 novels, including the international bestsellers What I Loved and The Summer Without Men. Last year, she published the far-reaching essay collection, Mothers, Fathers, and Others, which draws on her interdisciplinary knowledge to consider the broader meanings of the maternal in a culture shaped by misogyny. She has published papers in various academic and scientific journals and is the recipient of numerous awards, including the prestigious Princesa de Asturias Award for Literature, the European Charles Villon Essay Prize, an American Academy of the Arts and Letters Award in Literature, and her most recent novel, The Blazing World, was long-listed for the Man Booker Prize and won the Los Angeles Book Prize for Fiction. In 2012, she was awarded the International Gabaron Prize for Thought and Humanities, and her work has been translated into over 30 languages. Carmen Bujosa is a poet and narrator. She studied literature in the prestigious programs at the Universidad Iberoamericana and the UNAM, and she is the author of 18 novels, 15 collections of poetry, 4 plays, 2 collections of short stories, and 1 screenplay. Among the prizes that she has received for her work are included the Javier Villarrutia Prize for her novel Antes, the Café Guillón Novel Prize for El Complot de los Románticos, the Rosalia de Castro Prize, the Casa de America Prize for American Poetry in 2019, and most recently, in 2021, she received the Jorge Barguengoitia Prize for Literature from the University of Guanajuato. Carmen Bujosa has been a visiting professor at numerous universities, including Georgetown University, the Sorbonne, New York University, and Columbia University. She is currently a distinguished lecturer at Macaulay Honors College in CUNY. Denise Dresser
es una analista política y una erudita. Tiene un doctorado en ciencias políticas por parte de la Universidad de Princeton y es la autora de muchas publicaciones en política mexicana y las relaciones México-estadounidenses. Ella tiene 2 talk shows políticos y comenta frecuentemente la política mexicana y también estadounidense y canadiense. También es consultora en el programa de desarrollo de las Naciones Unidas y también realiza muchas investigaciones para el Banco de Montreal. Ha sido parte del Consejo de Investigación de los Estudios Democráticos y la Academia Mundial de Artes y Ciencias, y también es parte de la Junta de la Comisión de Derechos Humanos de la Ciudad de México y lo ha sido por 8 años. También ha sido parte de los estudios de la Universidad de California y San Diego y la Universidad de Georgetown, entre otras. En el 2010 ella ganó el Premio de Periodismo. En el 2015 fue condecorada con la Legión de Honor generada por el gobierno francés. Muchísimas gracias a nuestros miembros y a nuestra audiencia por estar con nosotros esta noche. ¿Puedo comenzar? Sí, adelante.
Good evening.
Muy
It's a great
buenas
pleasure
tardes.
for
Es un gran
you to join
placer
us
que estén con
because I think
nosotros esta
that
tarde,
the
puesto que
title
considero
of
que
the
el
talk
título
of our
de esta
conversation
plática de
captures the
nuestra
spirit of the three of
conversación
us,
encapsula el
subversive
espíritu
women.
de
And I
nosotras
want
tres como
to
mujeres
and
subversivas.
would like to
Me
exhort
gustaría de
you
igual
all
manera
to join
invitarles a
us
todos
in the
a
international
unirse a
and
nosotros
growing club
en el Club
of subversive
Internacional y
women
Creciente
led
de
today by
Mujeres
the women of
Subversivas,
Iran,
liderado por el
among
día de hoy
many
por las
others.
mujeres de Irán, entre muchas otras.
I'd like to start
Me
off by
gustaría
asking a
comenzar
question to Siri. In a recent essay, you describe with enormous poignancy the experience of being driven at age 16 by your 21-year-old boyfriend to a women's clinic in Minneapolis back when abortion was illegal to get a pregnancy test. And you discover subsequently that you are not pregnant. But that's the lead-in to the piece, The Toxic Thinking Behind the Supreme Court's Destruction of Abortion Rights. So, Siri, why is it time to be afraid of being a woman again?
Okay. You know, I had never told that story publicly. And I was in the south of France with my family. And I realized that the Supreme Court decision had made it more urgent to make clear that this is both a personal and political issue, right? And that the idea of the state legislating women's uteruses, which is what is happening, is something that authoritarian regimes inevitably do, right? And the United States, now with the Supreme Court, a right-wing Supreme Court, is doing exactly what they said they would do if Trump got his picks into the Supreme Court. This is a human rights issue, and it is now, of course, for people who have a female reproductive system, this is urgent. And I think my rage at that decision, which I'd actually written about earlier in a leak for the Spanish newspaper El País, it just moved me to tell that story about my pregnancy fear when I was 16. And, you know, I would not have continued that pregnancy no matter what. So I would have resorted to illegal means.
And you also talk about how your daughter calls you and tells you that she is pregnant. And yet she has the option living
Yes.
in, I guess it's is in New York?
Yes.
Yeah.
I said, you're in New York. Don't worry. I mean, she said, Mom, I have something to tell you. I have something to tell you. And I thought she had, possibly a fatal illness. You know, she had been I knew it was medical. And then when she told me, I thought, well, thank heaven you're in New York. You can decide. It's up to you. It's no longer, that's the case in New York State now. But if this election in the United States moves in a bad direction, the Republicans could make federal legislation outlawing abortion. And then, nobody is safe.
I would have a question for you both. And my question has to do with the first issues that the title, The Subversive Woman, La Subversión de las Mujeres. And there my question is to both of you, what makes it these movements of women nowadays much more than they were in the 80s, much more than they were in the 60s, much more than they were in the 19th century? Why do they feel today so important is it because they are talking not only about the public, but they are also talking about the private? Is it because the fact that when the former operative world worked, women were that half of the population that was enslaved to give pleasure, comfort, and everything for the other half of the population that were men, when the ideal model worked? Is it that why they didn't have the right to have property, the right to leave their owners, meaning their husbands or their parents? What's happening today? Is it because it touches from the privacy to the public, or is it just by chance that we have seen these women gathering, these revolts, this subversive movement happening all around the world, not like a viral thing, not contagious, but it's like enough is enough. No es no.
Yeah. I think we're in an era of women's subversion becoming probably the primordial or the most impactful form of subversion, of political and social opposition in the world, in a way that it hadn't happened before. Because what occurred in the 1980s, we were discussing this before we came in. In the 1980s, there was a huge backlash against feminism around the world, and especially in the United States, that came as a response to Gloria Steinem, to women burning their bras, to taking the streets, to try to legislate. Remember, legislation that has not passed to this day in the United States. So then you get Phyllis Schlafly, you get what Susan Faludi describes in her book, where conservatives come back into power and try to stop women in their tracks. So what happens in the 1980s? Feminism becomes very unpopular. Remember, back then, we didn't even say that we were feminists. It was politically incorrect to say that you were a feminist. I edited a book of women called Gritos y Susurros, Experiencias Intempestivas de 38 Mujeres, and my publisher said, don't say that it's a feminist book, even though women are starting to tell their stories, because people aren't going to buy it. And then what happens? I think there's a critical moment with the Me Too movement that revives women's issues, that leads younger women of a, I think, braver, more empowered generation, better educated, more socially mobile, more outspoken, at least more than we were at their age. And they come out into the streets, and the personal becomes political. Yeah. And they start telling their stories with a degree of courage and of transparency that I never had about my own experience regarding abortion or contraception or sexuality. So they open up the road, and I think that there's a paradigmatic shift in the world. And then you see the women in Chile taking to the streets and crying, "El violador eres tú." And this has international resonance, yes. And it has a demonstration effect. And this is parallel to what starts emerging in the world, and I say this as a political scientist, the rise of authoritarian populism, both on the left and on the right. Right. And the one thing that authoritarian populists have in common is that they seek to control women's bodies, women's place in society, how women think, how they act. Remember Margaret Atwood's article in The Atlantic recently where she says, when I wrote The Handmaid's Tale, it was meant to be a dystopic fantasy. I never thought that it was going to be prescient. Yes. So authoritarians band together and they start carrying out many of the same policies, which is take away women's rights or silence women or have them put on the burqa again or the hijab. And what you see in Iran, I think, is essentially an Iranian demonstration of something that is happening globally, which is we will not be silenced anymore. We have rights. We want to express ourselves. And that, of course, takes on a political significance. Because you're not only fighting the patriarchy, you're fighting oppressive governments that essentially take away rights. And women are now leading the charge against authoritarians in their multiple incarnations across the globe.
Right. So I'd like to just back up a little bit. In one of his books about the old French regime, the Ancien Régime, de Tocqueville, who also wrote a famous book called Democracy in America, says that until people know that things can be different, they will not revolt, right? You have to have an imaginative vision of something else. I also think, in this case, that women, young women, a lot of young women, are assuming the authority vested in them by an ideal democratic reality, right? And by doing that, they are taking on more authority than I think. What is authority? It's legitimate power. Legitimate power. So by assuming that, you see it in Iran, you saw it in Chile, you see these people saying, no, I am not buying the hierarchical thinking that was part of my mother and grandmother's generation, which becomes part of an unconscious attitude, right? Becomes part of an unconscious attitude that you believe in the hierarchy. You believe that men deserve to be placated and helped and taken care of because that's simply part of the unconscious system that we were all brought up in.
I want to read a quote from Siri. Los patriarcas no defraudan. I'll read it in Spanish, she knows it in English. No ven y no escuchan. Suelen permanecer sordos a las mujeres. Se pavonean, alardean y actúan como si no estuviéramos ahí. Y agrega Siri, y no siempre son hombres.
Siri, why don't I translate to you what you wrote?
Thanks, okay.
that patriarchs don't disappoint, that they routinely do not understand, listen, or acknowledge our presence.
Yeah,
They try to make us invisible. And reacting to something
yes.
that Carmen said, in our own country, I would say that the most legitimate and feisty and creative opposition to authoritarianism in Mexico today is feminism. Yeah. And you see women taking to the streets. I mean, what are the social groups that the Mexican president fears the most? The one that he actually erects steel barriers around the National Palace because he's scared of the most. It's women. Yeah. Women who also don't fear not using violence, but are willing to be out there, using their bodies in a very symbolic way, throwing gas and bazookas. And as you probably know, Siri, this is a country that has been experiencing a wave of femicide.
Yes.
In Iran, it's cover your face and disappear, and in Mexico, we're going to kill 9 women a day. and bury them and make them disappear.
And burn them.
And burn them.
That which Siri has written about it.
I mean, this is fascinating, right? That femicide, you know, this is in the scholarship. I'm not taking credit for it, but that the modes of execution, the modes of murder are different for female and male victims. This is extremely interesting. In a book by Kate Mann, an analytical scholar, she wrote a book called Down Girl about misogyny.
Yeah.
And you find it in a footnote, which is typical of analytical philosophers. But when she was in the 2nd grade, she won a spelling bee. She came in #1. And the boy who came in #2 nearly killed her by trying to strangle her after. Strangling is a very common mode of femicide, not just in Mexico, but elsewhere. And the symbolic significance of this is really important, isn't it? Because it's shutting the woman up, literally, by shutting off her windpipe and her ability to speak.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, Siri, you talk in one of your recent essays about a belligerent theatrical masculinity that accompanies current political movements, particularly of the right. And I think we've seen that belligerent theatrical masculinity in many world leaders, perhaps in some of our own partners over the years. And where do you think that comes from? Why does it exist? Why does it continue to live on?
I think in some ways it is a kind of performance, even when it's lived, right? It's a kind of performance for the other. And in times like ours, when, let's face it, women, and I don't want to ignore very important issues here that I keep saying, this is not just about male-female, it's also about what has been called intersectionality in American scholarship, which is that it's race, gender, right, and class.
Yeah.
These are very important, and they have different manifestations in different cultures, right? Race is different in Mexico than it is in the United States, a different history. Nevertheless, it plays into, or you think about India, I've been reading about Hindu nationalism, which was influenced by the Nazis in Germany, but took aspects of Nazism and then applied it to a kind of religious social hierarchy that targeted Muslims. I mean, we see this happening in different ways, and they're very hybrid movements. Anyway, the belligerent masculinity thing is part of acting the backlash. You know, Donald Trump understood that by acting out this almost 1950s fantasy of the white American man, that he would garner support by men who were feeling, and women who support them, who were feeling humiliated by the raising up of others, especially a black man as president of the United States, right? Whoa, was that a blow? Now, it isn't because their power has been affected. It is the very sight of a woman or a black or brown or gay or, you know, transgender person being elevated in the culture is a way of humiliating them. They feel shame. So what is Bolsonaro, Trump, Orban? These men are, what I've written this, roots from shame to pride.
And to, as I mentioned to you earlier,
Yes.
to revenge.
Right. To revenge.
Their aim, the strangling.
Yeah, yes. So what Kate Mann says is that misogyny is punishment. It's the police force of the hierarchy, right? When the woman really is acting in an authoritative way, you bring out the big clubs.
I want to tilt a moment the conversation a little bit to other side. And I want to tilt it to this. Siri would like to be named as an author of feminine literature. I wouldn't either. Not that I don't think my writing is, and Siri's, is impregnated by being a woman. But it has something on it that wants to constrain the power of art that is so wide. And if you put those labels on it, if you say, oh, this is a feminist novel, I'm not talking in the criteria of the publisher that told you whatever he told you. I'm talking from my point of view, that I adore so many, especially Latin American women authors, but also from other countries, and Siri is one of my favorites. I adore them because they are so brilliant, so intelligent. They capture all the tradition. They subvert it. They make it a book, a novel, a poem that is alive, and that I would not call women's literature. I wouldn't call it feminist literature. I would not put those labels. Out of what? Even of respect of their persons and obviously of their literary persons. Because we are, all of us, we have complex universes that are tainted by a lot of genders inside. We are inside 3 times men, 4 times women, 5 times this, and then you build your personality with that. I understand that certain kind of social order in which we are still immersed, and we have been immersed during centuries, needs to have oppressed, not only at home, but to have slaves that slavery wasn't abolished so long ago, but those that don't need a label of slaves, but they are slaves, badly paid people, all that inequality, you need to use criteria, and then you invent and say, oh, women, oh, race, and also then with women, the envy comes much before, because women can have babies. And though Siri has written about this, in some cultures, men enact the act of having a baby and giving birth, and they do the whole ritual without giving the baby out, which is the best way to participate. But in our culture, in our world, envy is what rules. But not, I'm not talking, I'm only just going into another, I'm just tilting the conversation, and I'm sorry, persons, if I bore you, because these women are so political and they have so much to say about that. But I am a poet, I'm a novelist, and this, for me, puzzles me. So yes, I understand that I don't want to be called a woman with a label, sorry.
No, but I actually agree with Carmen, right? So we don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about gender, but we are masculinizing and feminizing things all the time, right? We're turning, I like to use this example, eating steak is masculine and having a salad is feminine. Now, there's absolutely nothing feminine or masculine about lettuce or meat, right? I mean, we know that. It's ridiculous. Or my other, because I've been so involved in the sciences, physics is masculine. Poetry is feminine. That's actually not true in Iran, right? There are other places in the world where poetry is certainly not regarded as a feminine art. So we have to be very careful about how we gender everything. And I think, you know, including, as you mentioned, something I'm very interested in as biology and reproductive biology, is that that, of course, is, for a person who chooses to have a baby, children, that it's a big deal. And I think it's, should be a big deal for fathers too. And, we've had a system that has also deprived men they've deprived men of the pleasures of parenthood. And that has been somewhat corrected, I think, or it's getting better. I mean, when I was growing up, you never saw a man pushing a baby carriage. Never. This has certainly changed in the United States, and not only among the middle classes, but, with other people, working class people, it's different. So we see how social mores change and how we label them as masculine or feminine, depending on the time, the place. The imagination has no sex. I really believe that. You think it does?
And I don't think that sensibility or intelligence or bravery has a sex. And I say this because I've never wanted to be labeled as a woman political scientist.
Right.
A woman columnist. Although when I joined Proceso magazine, which is an influential political weekly in this country, in 1999, I was the first woman to ever write in the opinion section.
Wow.
And I entered a male-dominated world, and it's still a male-dominated world. If you look at the opinion section of the newspapers, there are like token women.
Yes.
And that's why this editorial effort, Opinión 51, was created, because we are 51% of the population. We should have 51% of the representation in terms of creating public opinion. But I can't tell you the number of panels, events, conferences where I was the only woman. Yeah. And the men sitting next to me were chatting with each other while I was speaking. And I've tried to, for a long time, I tried to remove the feminine out of my writing. And remove the first person and personal experiences out of my writing, because I thought that was a way of leveling the playing field and that I wouldn't be judged by my gender. Unfortunately, we live in such a misogynistic culture that people want to put you in your gender box. So I'll give you an example. The president in the morning press conference, when he alludes to me, which is basically every week, he calls me La Señora Dresser, which is Mrs. Dresser. It's not even Miss or doctor or professor. It's Mrs. Dresser. And the Mrs., the Señora, carries a weighty connotation. The connotation is, what are you doing as a woman criticizing me, a man with the authority, when you should be at home baking cookies, like Hillary Clinton used to say?
Acting like a missus.
Acting like a missus, exactly. Go back to your place. Go back to your role. Yes. And if you criticize, then you're angry. You are sexually unfulfilled. You're growing old. You're drying up. You must be menopausal. You must not have good sex. You're hysterical. And even though, as I say, analytics and intelligence and sensitivity and bravery are not engendered, society genders you.
That's right. I think this is fair, but I do think what Carmen is trying to say, that the flexibility, the elasticity of the imagination includes, multiple gendered realities. Louise Bourgeois, one of my favorite artists, said we are all masculine and feminine, and her work is, I think, a tribute to that kind of flexibility, not being stuck in some identity hole. So despite the fact that we are often treated as hysterical or alarmist or out of control, I think you know, that the work one does when it's good is avoiding those kind of categorical boxes that trap us in places that are very uncomfortable and I think damaging really to psyche soma.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I think the capital we have with our literary traditions speaks us of that being explored before. I think, for example, of Cervantes. He did auto-fiction in the middle of Quixote. Yes. He tells the story of his captivity in the middle of it. So I think of Lope de Vega, the great Lope de Vega. He talks about his torn self and his intimate life and those things that are somebody would think is that feminine. No, it is us. And also I think it's important to revolt against being called with those labels. I like the idea of calling sometimes escritoros. But escritoros are some kind of escritoro that is using a male...
Just, perhaps it won't make sense to you, Siri, but in Spanish, there is a distinction between a woman writer or a male writer, whereas in the English language, it's just a writer.
Yeah. Although people do say women writers, so at one point I started talking about man writers. And as soon as you say man writer, you understand how odd that sounds. Because as Simone de Beauvoir pointed out years ago in 1949, the man is standing in for a universal. And I think some of the agitation, and I wanted to mention Carmen's talking about tradition. And in your work, I'm thinking particularly now of the book of Anna, about playing with the Tolstoy novel, which is a subversive fiction about a classic fiction, which rewrites in a highly both ironic, vivid, and intelligent way, using often, I think, very feminist positions. It's a kind of the book is, and I'm punning a little here, a kind of explosion of certain classical tropes in literature.
It's inevitable. It's there. I think of that book of poems I wrote in 1980 that we now redid because Magali Lara had done the paintings, and now I worked on it again, and we just published here in Nuevo León again the book, and I see the rage there, and even expressing rage is feminist, because as Siri has written clearly, women should not feel rage. They have to be like sheep, like in another poem of Lope de Vega, by the way, he calls his beloved his sheep, his property and soft.
I don't know if she must be translated, but there's a beautiful essay by Audre Lorde, the American writer, about the uses of anger.
Yes.
And she's talking particularly about black women and including, some real pushes against certain forms of white feminism. This is not a new essay, but it's a beautiful evocation about how anger can be channeled. Anger is is an emotion that's aimed outside. Right?
Yeah. I wrote a piece for the Americas Quarterly recently that the first sentence was, Mexican women are angry, and they are legitimately angry. Yeah. They have a legitimate reason to be angry. And yet you have authorities that respond to that anger with why are you defacing monuments? Why are you painting walls? Why are you throwing paint bombs, purple and green paint bombs? Why are you kicking women policewomen? Denying the legitimacy of women's anger. And I think this has been a common thread. One of my favorite books, I'm sure you've read it, both of you have read it, Women in Power, Mary Beard, about how women's voices, women's angry voices, women's voices of any kind have been silenced for millennia. The book begins with Penelope being sent back to her room by her son because she's told that she doesn't have the right to speak in the public space. And I think I love your work about the broader meaning of the maternal and how it's shaped by misogyny, because in my own experience as a mother of a ferocious 26-year-old, I taught her to express anger and to think of herself as an Amazon and to think that she had a right to belong and to think as when she was born, when I was cradling her in my arms, and I thought, how could I have made something so beautiful? Me, maybe with her father, a little bit, but I told her, I'm going to give you the best education in the world, because I thought then, and I still do, that is the best way or it's one of the ways of being a feminist.
Well, talking about education, I think they are asking us to finish and behave like not three furious ladies, but three just diplomatic ladies that I want to say thanks, Denise, Siri. It's a beauty to be with an angry, professional angry political commentator, and with this escritore or escritoro that is Siri, that is so feminine and so other things too.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining us.
Yay!
A nombre del Tecnológico de Monterrey, agradecemos la participación de nuestras valiosas invitadas y asistentes. De la misma manera, los invitamos a que sigan participando en la Feria Internacional del Libro Monterrey edición 2022. Por su atención, muchas gracias.